Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're taking on something really important. We're stepping well outside the usual mainstream sources.
We are. We're going beyond that corporate echo chamber
Right.
to look into the December 2025 issue of a publication that has, it's become this huge force in independent media in Canada.
We're talking about Druthers newspaper.
Exactly. And our goal here isn't just to, read some articles. It's to really explore the conversations and the ideas that are resonating with a massive part of the Canadian population.
A part that often feels totally left out of the conversation in traditional media.
Right. We're looking at the intelligence that's being shared and discussed within this really powerful community.
And the scale of it's genuinely staggering. For anyone listening who might not know, Druthers is Canada's largest independent, people-powered newspaper.
Just for this month's issue, the one we're holding, they printed 200,000 copies.
200,000.
Yeah.
That's just 1 month.
Yeah, and get this, since 2020, they've distributed over 15 million newspapers across the country.
Wow. That's not a niche thing. That's a real grassroots movement.
It is. It's fueled by community action, created, supported, and handed out entirely by everyday Canadians.
And its core promise is what makes it so different right now. Honest, independent reporting. It's completely free from any government funding, any corporate influence.
That kind of independence is so rare now. We have a genuine appreciation for what a platform like that represents. It's a direct channel for people to share information that matters to them.
So our mission today is to dive into those ideas, those themes, and the really critical conversations that the people reading and supporting Druthers are having.
We're going to examine the messages being discussed outside of those carefully controlled mainstream channels. And we're starting with a really deep and, frankly, a deeply troubling look at what these writers see as institutional failures targeting the most vulnerable among us.
Okay, let's unpack that first big theme. It really centers on a perceived lack of integrity, accountability, and what one writer sees as the explicit targeting of vulnerable populations, specifically Canadian veterans.
Right. This starts with a piece by Kelsey Sharon, and it's an analysis of Canada's MAiD regime. We need to be really careful and impartial here because the accusations the writer's making they're profound.
They are. So Kelsey Sharon, she starts her article with a specific and pretty shocking incident, an email.
Yeah, an email received by a retired RCMP veteran who's just identified as LK on November 20th.
And this email wasn't just to him. It went out to Nova Scotia RCMP veterans, promoting a session on medical assistance in dying.
The writer, Sharon, she doesn't pull any punches with her language. She calls it grooming and coercion.
That's a heavy accusation.
It is. The core argument she's making is that a state-aligned institution is actively normalizing death as a service and offering it to the very people, our veterans, that the system already failed to support.
So it's framed as an educational session, but the writer is arguing the subtext is manipulative.
Exactly. And the person they invited to speak is central to her argument. It's why she calls him a death peddler.
Okay, who is the speaker?
It was a Dr. Gordon Gubbitz. He is the clinical lead for MAiD in Nova Scotia. He's also an active assessor and provider of the procedure. His involvement is, foundational.
Right, so this isn't some neutral third party. He's an architect of the system.
He is. The writer points out that Dr. Gubbitz is on the board of CAMAP. That's the Canadian Association of MAiD Assessors and Providers. Sharon calls it a pro-death organization that's actively working to expand access to MAiD.
And he also helped write the national MAiD curriculum.
That's what the article says. Training other doctors on how to present MAiD as just another care option, not as, the end of the line.
What's really striking in the article is the emphasis on who wasn't invited.
Right. There were no trauma specialists, no palliative care experts, no mental health advocates, no one talking about promising new treatments like psychedelic-assisted therapy.
So by only inviting the MAiD provider and assessor?
The writer's point is that they were, in effect, only inviting death to the conversation.
And you have to think about the psychological pressure this creates. The audience here is veterans. They're often dealing with PTSD, chronic pain, traumatic brain injury.
And just, that soul-crushing bureaucratic despair from trying to get help from Veterans Affairs.
So Sharon calls this the soft coercive stage of the regime. The state doesn't have to order anyone to die.
No, just introducing the idea, this early exit option, sponsored by a trusted institution, is enough to plant a seed in a population that's already feeling hopeless.
And the venue. They held it in a church hall. The writer says that was a strategic choice to give it a sense of moral legitimacy.
Yeah, veneer of community warmth over something really ethically fraught.
And this isn't happening in a vacuum. The writer connects it to past failures.
She does. She reminds us that Veterans Affairs employees have been caught offering MAiD to veterans who never even asked for it.
Like the case of Christine, the veteran who's just trying to get a wheelchair ramp for her home.
And instead, she was offered information on how to end her life. It's unbelievable.
This is all set against the backdrop of the government cutting over $4 billion in care for veterans.
The writer presents this powerful argument. The system first creates the despair by withholding care, and then it offers MAiD as the solution to that despair.
Kelsey Sharon's final warning in the piece is, it's chilling. She says veterans are the canaries in Canada's moral coal mine.
Meaning, if the state can successfully normalize this procedure for the people who wore its uniform, who risked their lives for the country,
then they can normalize it for anyone. The writer argues this isn't an accident, it's an engineered culture shift.
shifting from the vulnerability of veterans to the integrity of our institutions. The next piece is from Vincent Gircys. He's a retired OPP officer.
And he's exploring what he sees as the erosion of police independence, which he says is a constitutional necessity for a free country.
Right. And he makes the case that this isn't some sudden collapse. It's a gradual erosion, a slow chipping away at police autonomy that's guided by political direction and ideological control.
So how does that start?
He says it starts quietly, with subtle changes in policy language, with where the funding goes, with political guidance, and the result is this internal chilling effect.
Officers start to hesitate. They think twice before starting an investigation that might, embarrass an elected official.
And he gives some really powerful, specific examples. The first one is the case of Ottawa Police Detective Helen Gruss.
I remember this. She faced internal charges just for starting inquiries into unexplained infant deaths without getting prior authorization.
Exactly. And the writer says the implication there is huge. It's not just about one detective. It's the precedent it sets.
It sends the message that truth can be managed, that some investigations need to be cleared politically before they can even begin.
And the second example is just as alarming. It's the 2022 Nova Scotia mass murders investigation.
Right, where evidence showed the RCMP commissioner, Brenda Lucki, was pressuring investigators to release specific details about the firearms used.
And the article says the explicit reason was to support the federal government's gun control legislation that was being debated at that very moment.
So, political timing over investigative integrity.
That's the argument. Gircys says this shows how policing is shifting from a community service model to one of political compliance.
And that this is being engineered from the inside.
Yeah, he talks about police training academies now emphasizing things like diversity, equity, and inclusion, which he frames as a kind of political loyalty test, sometimes over core investigative skills.
And officers who question it risk their careers. So you get a culture of compliance, not one of courage.
The result you see on the street is selective enforcement. Protesters for one cause are treated differently than protesters for another. It just destroys public trust.
Gircys reminds everyone that the oath of office is to uphold the law and the Constitution, not the government of the day.
And he points to this recent development in Ontario that he calls alarming. Since April 1st, 2024, he says Ontario police officers now have to seek permission before conducting any criminal investigation.
Wow. If that's the case, it institutionalizes the idea that police are subservient to politicians.
That's his point. It destroys public confidence. He mentions the Grist Justice Project is trying to reverse this trend to restore police autonomy.
Because if investigations have to go through political filters first, then the search for truth becomes a negotiation. It serves power, not justice.
And all these systemic failures lead us right into the next theme in the paper, the invisible chains, the things that bind the individual, that lead to dependency and compliance in modern life.
And we start with a piece by Dr. Jeffrey Overall on how the system of work itself is fundamentally broken.
Right. And Dr. Overall's research, it paints a really bleak picture. He talks about this quiet mental health crisis being driven by our jobs.
He says 50% of full-time employees are burnt out, and 76% are struggling with work-life imbalance. He has this vivid line about people waiting for retirement like inmates etching days on a cell wall.
And he's really critical of the typical corporate solutions, more benefits, more prescriptions, and other wellness workshops.
He says those just treat the symptoms.
Exactly. Not the underlying disease, which is a system that demands constant, unsustainable acceleration. Modern work, he says, is all high pressure, low control, and very little real creativity.
And that just leads to exhaustion and chronic stress. So what do people do?
They escape through consumption, alcohol, food, shopping, endless scrolling on their phones.
Driven by that comparison engine of social media, trying to keep up with everyone else's curated success.
And that creates what he calls a vicious cycle. The consumption leads to debt. The debt makes you dependent on the job you hate.
And the noose just gets tighter.
Right. And here's the crucial political implication he draws. He asserts that a population that is burnt out, exhausted, and in debt is just easier to control.
More persuadable, less likely to resist.
He argues that this state of mass passivity is exactly what any totalitarian regime needs to survive, because an energetic, self-sufficient public is its greatest threat.
That's a fascinating and pretty chilling claim. That control can be achieved just through engineered exhaustion.
So what's the way out? He offers some practical steps.
The first one is just awareness. Wake up to the system. Refuse to normalize the suffering and question the idea that being exhausted means you're dedicated.
And then number 2, he says to build a go-to-hell account.
I love that name.
It's powerful, isn't it? Having 3 to 6 months of savings, it's not just about money, it's an emotional buffer. It replaces fear with choice.
Then he talks about entrepreneurship as an act of personal reclamation, designing work that serves your life, not the other way around.
And finally, he touches on exploring new frontiers of healing, specifically mentioning things like guided psilocybin sessions for treatment-resistant trauma and anxiety.
Helping people reconnect with themselves, away from all that chronic stress.
You know, as we talk about this, it really highlights why these voices, why this entire issue of Druthers is so important.
Absolutely. They are actively challenging the very systems of exhaustion and compliance that Dr. Overall just dissected.
These critical conversations, they're only happening because independent media exists and because people are actively supporting it.
People just like you, listening right now, you are the reason this information gets out.
So if you're getting value from this, if some of these ideas are connecting the dots for you, we'd ask you just take a moment, hit that like button, subscribe, and most importantly, share this deep dive.
It might feel like a small thing just hitting share, but it is so much more powerful than you realize. Every single share creates this huge ripple effect.
It amplifies independent voices and helps more Canadians find information that's deliberately kept outside of that controlled mainstream narrative.
Druthers is people-powered, completely free from corporate money, and that's how we're powered too, by you.
We really do appreciate everyone who chooses to stand behind this kind of media, so thank you. Now, let's get back to those invisible chains.
Okay, the next writer, Denny Jared Frank. He takes this theme of dependency even further. His argument is arresting. He says slavery never really ended, it just evolved.
Yeah, he argues that physical chains were replaced by debt, by screens, and by invisible laws that are designed to bind the mind.
The modern person, he says, is trained to believe they're free because they can choose what to consume.
He identifies the first and most powerful of these modern chains as money itself. He says it was weaponized to monopolize our time and our energy. He calls the financial system a form of extractionary feudalism.
With central banks replacing monarchs.
Exactly. Then he talks about psychological programming. He says the education system conditions us for obedience, not critical thinking. Compliance is rewarded, imagination is punished.
He argues that's intentional, to create a compliant population that doesn't question the fundamentals of the system.
And then there's what he calls the media's leash, delivered through our screens. The news tells us what to fear, entertainment tells us what to desire.
And social media tells us who we should be. The writer's point is that truth gets drowned in a sea of triviality and distraction.
Which leaves people divided, distracted, and addicted to comfortable illusions.
And he calls technology the perfect prison. Our devices aren't just tools, they're harvesting our data to predict and manipulate our behavior.
And as AI gets smarter, it learns to predict dissent before it even happens. Privacy is totally eroded.
Frank's conclusion is that the world isn't really run by the governments we see. It's run by an unelected network financial institutions, media conglomerates, all united by the motive of control.
A hidden empire. But he says the deepest slavery is internal. When we become our own warden out of fear of rejection or a hunger for validation.
So for him, liberation starts with awareness, seeing the system for what it is.
Then self-sufficiency, growing food, learning practical skills, building local networks. The antidote to dependency is autonomy.
And finally, community, uniting over a shared purpose, not shared consumption.
And this idea of digital control and deep dependency leads us perfectly into Henry's analysis of central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs.
Right. And his warning is stark. He says CBDCs aren't just about modernizing money, they are a fundamental step toward a comprehensive control mechanism over the population.
He argues that The whole narrative about convenience and security is just a mask for a deeper agenda.
An agenda to eliminate cash, which is the only real barrier to total financial control.
And that convenience, he warns, comes at the cost of absolute privacy and the total loss of financial independence.
Walk me through the surveillance part. How does that work?
Well, by linking every transaction you make to a central ledger controlled by the bank, CBDCs allow for constant real-time surveillance of every single purchase.
So financial autonomy, your ability to spend your money as you see fit, becomes a privilege that's granted by the state based on your compliance.
Right. He also argues it's a super efficient taxation tool. It would allow for automated instant tax deductions. The government would have direct, frictionless access to your funds.
And how do they get us to adopt this?
He says it's a gradual process. They just make cash more and more inconvenient to use, slowly forcing people onto the digital system until there's no other option.
The most critical warning Henry raises, though, is about real-time control.
Yet this is the scary part. Under a CBDC system, the government could instantly impose monetary policy. They could freeze your account, fine you for non-compliance.
Or even limit what you can buy. They could cap how much you spend on certain goods, or even put an expiry date on your money to force you to spend it.
The ability to instantly punish dissent is what makes it potentially dystopian.
If money is the ultimate chain, like the last writer said, then CBDCs are the perfect digital lock.
That intense focus on digital chains now pushes us to look at the bigger picture, at the systemic level. We're talking high-level government decay and geopolitical shifts.
And we start with Stan McDonald's piece on the double-edged sword of artificial intelligence.
Right. McDonald acknowledges the potential of AI, of course, but he quickly gets to the anxieties, the biggest one being job displacement.
He cites estimates that up to 30% of jobs could be automated by the mid-2030s.
And his assessment is pretty sober. He says fighting AI isn't a viable strategy. Job security in the future will depend on AI literacy, your ability to use and manage these tools.
But the ethical risks are huge, especially with government use. He talks about the black box problem.
Yeah, where AI systems inherit or even amplify societal biases in things like hiring or policing. We can see the AI's decision, but the logic behind it is hidden, opaque, so there's no accountability.
And McDonald says what's really concerning in Canada is how specific laws are already making these risks worse. He points to Bill C-2, the Strong Borders Act.
Okay, so break that down for our listeners. The writer argues Bill C-2 gives the state really broad authority to access our digital communications and private data with a very low bar for suspicion.
So when you combine that power with an AI that can process all that data, you get deep algorithmic surveillance of people's private lives with almost no oversight.
Then there's Bill C-8, which mandates cybersecurity monitoring for critical infrastructure, power grids, financial systems.
The writer warns this could require installing invasive surveillance tools or creating backdoors for unaccountable access, all run by AI with very little human oversight.
And finally, Bills C-5 and C-9, which allow for AI-generated evidence to be used in court and by public administration.
So you could have life-altering decisions, court rulings, benefits, eligibility being made by an algorithm with very little ability to challenge its logic if it's flawed.
But the ultimate risk he details is the deep fake threat, AI-generated video and audio that are indistinguishable from reality.
He says this fuels truth decay, polarization, and mass confusion because you can no longer trust what you see or hear. Even verifiable evidence can be convincingly faked.
Now, from digital policy to another major file, immigration. Riley Donovan's piece calls it Canada's most intractable policy disaster.
He starts by highlighting the astronomical increase in temporary residents, or TRs. He says the TR population went from 3.3% of the population in 2018 to 7.5% in 2024.
And he argues that's what's straining our housing, our healthcare, our food banks. The new Carney government has committed to reducing that number to under 5% by 2027.
And they plan to do that by cutting the annual intake of new TRs like study permits.
But, and this is the key detail the writer flags, the plan to shrink the total TR population isn't about sending people home. It's about dramatically increasing the rate at which existing TRs are given permanent residency.
Okay, so let's walk through the math here because it's pretty eye-opening.
The previous government predicted TRs would account for over 40% of all new permanent residents in 2025. Donovan assumes the new government's rate will be at least 50% to hit their target.
So the government's total permanent resident goal is about 1.288 million over the next 3 years.
And if, As the writer assumes, at least half of those spots go to temporary residents already here.
You get a number around 718,000, an estimated 718,000 TRs becoming permanent residents. Donovan calls it a mass transfer of Canadian citizenship.
Right, and it's being done quietly, under the cover of a policy that's supposed to be reducing the TR population.
The writer points to the political spin on this from Finance Minister Champagne, who basically said, well, if they've been here for 4 or 5 years, they're not really temporary anymore, and we need the workers.
Donovan's critique is that this is really about appeasing the business lobby. It's a way to convert cheap, low-skill foreign labor into citizens to secure that labor supply, and it may not reflect what the Canadian public actually wants.
Following on that theme of government action, Gerald Heinrichs tackles the issue of uncontrolled bureaucracy.
Yeah, he challenges the belief that bigger government is always the solution. He argues its growth is inefficient and totally unsustainable.
And he brings the numbers. He says since 2016, the federal government added 99,000 new bureaucrats, and the overall cost of government operations went up by 77%.
And that growth isn't even. He points to Immigration, Refugee, and Citizenship Canada, which expanded by 105%. That number lines up perfectly with what Riley Donovan was just talking about.
And this all comes at a huge cost to the taxpayer. He says Canadian Tax Freedom Day in 2025 was June 8th. We worked 44% of the year just to pay our taxes.
And even with all that revenue, the government is still spending way more than it brings in. They had to borrow another $78 billion. The total federal debt is now over $1.2 trillion.
And the writer points to ideological spending as a key driver of this, with new layers of bureaucracy just to implement DEI and climate action initiatives.
Heinrichs contrasts this with what's happening elsewhere. He points to the big cuts under the new MAiD government in Argentina.
And in the U.S., this Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, that cut $214 billion by canceling diversity and gender politics programs. His message is that this path of ever bigger government is fiscally unsustainable.
Now, the issue broadens its scope even more to look at geopolitics. There's an article from CanadaCitizensForum.ca asking a big question. Is the U.S. being removed as the world's #1 power?
It opens by quoting PM Mark Carney saying the relationship with the U.S. will never again be the same, while Foreign Minister Anita Anand is calling China a strategic partner.
And the writer notes that Canada, the EU, Mexico, they all seem to be distancing themselves from the U.S. The public narrative is that it's all because of former President Trump's tariffs.
But the writer argues that this narrative, crazy Trump attacking the world, hides a really important constitutional fact.
And this is the core of his argument. The U.S. president does not control tariffs. Congress does. It's right there in Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution.
Okay, so what's the implication of that?
The writer's thesis is that since Congress and the media aren't fighting these tariffs, it means the leadership of both parties actually approves of what's happening.
And if they approve, then the plan is to strategically isolate the United States. He's suggesting this is the official policy of what he calls the deep state, the permanent corporate and financial leadership.
He says this is the result of a decades-long process of wrecking the U.S., giving away manufacturing jobs for corporate profit, media promoting division and hate.
And that crushing $38 trillion national debt.
Get this. The article notes that the annual interest payments on that debt are now higher than the entire U.S. military budget.
Wow.
So the writer's prediction is severe. He says the plan is to remove the U.S. as the world's leading power, destroy the American middle class, and impoverish the nation, all while the stock market is being inflated before a final catastrophic collapse.
That deep dive into the forces shaping nations brings us to the most fundamental theme of this whole issue, the psychology of power and the mindset needed to resist.
We start with Leen de Boer's piece on the pathological minds behind power.
And he's drawing on the work of a Polish psychologist, Andrew Lowaczewski, and his book Political Ponerology.
Yeah, and ponerology is basically the study of how pathological people, psychopaths, narcissists, get into power and then lead civilizations to collapse.
The writer argues the problem isn't that power corrupts, it's that power attracts the already corruptible.
These pathological types, de Boer explains, are masters of manipulation. They use what Lowaczewski called the mask of sanity.
So they're social chameleons.
Exactly. And they co-opt moral language. They use words like inclusion, equity, or safety. To the public, it sounds compassionate. But to their inner circle, it really means compliance, control, or repression.
Using morality as a mask for domination.
And the writer has this chilling insight into how modern tyranny works. He says a regime doesn't need everyone's approval.
They only need a small percentage, right?
About 6 to 12%.
Yeah.
The true believers, the opportunists, the people willing to enforce the state's will.
And the rest of the population just submits out of fear. Fear of losing their job, of being targeted.
It's tyranny by submission. The vast majority chooses compliance over the moral burden of resistance.
Lobachevsky's warning was that if a civilization can't recognize this dynamic, can't see behind the pathological masks, it will just keep handing power to the people who want to exploit them.
And now we get to Dave Stach's article, which connects economic dependency directly to our biological health.
He starts by exposing what he calls the skills shortage myth. He says it's just an excuse to freeze wages and import cheap foreign labor instead of training Canadians.
He contrasts today with the 50s through the 80s, when real labor shortages led to huge wage increases and a thriving middle class. Now, he says, companies just cry for more immigration instead of offering competitive pay.
But then he adds this much darker layer to it, the biological breakdown of the population.
Yeah, he says since the 1970s, industrial farming and processed foods have just gutted the nutrient content of our diet. He says we're a nation of malnourished, low-energy people.
And he has some shocking data to back that up, especially for men.
Sperm counts down over 50% since the 70s. Crashing testosterone levels, skyrocketing rates of depression and apathy. He calls it biochemical warfare on our biology.
So what's the solution? He talks about orthomolecular solutions.
Right. This is the field pioneered by people like Linus Pauling. The idea that mental health and vitality depend on getting optimal levels of key nutrients, B vitamins, zinc, omega-3s that are missing from our food.
So he's arguing that a lot of modern illnesses like depression and anxiety are actually just severe malnutrition that's being misdiagnosed.
And here's how he ties it all back together. He says this biological decline is why the skills shortage myth works.
A low-vitality, nutrient-starved generation is more likely to just accept slave wages and compliance.
Than a healthy, high-energy worker from the 1970s would have been. He says the engineered worker just shrugs and scrolls TikTok instead of fighting for their rights.
Now, Lynn Davis takes us across the globe to Jamaica to show how a disaster can be used to push for systemic change.
She details the devastation from Hurricane Melissa, a Category 5 storm that hit in October 2025. It wiped out agriculture and entire towns.
And the key insight comes right after the storm. The Jamaican Prime Minister announced the recovery plan would be to build forward better.
A phrase the writer points out is directly connected to the global slogan, Build Back Better, and the UN 2030 agenda.
She says Jamaica had already adopted the UN's Sustainable Development Goals into its own long-term plan, Vision 2030 Jamaica, which even uses the slogan, leaving no one behind.
Davis's warning is that the average Jamaican, just focused on survival after the hurricane, is completely unaware that these recovery plans come with strings attached.
Strings that include drastic lifestyle changes baked into the SDGs. Things like total surveillance infrastructure, mandatory digital IDs, and 15-minute cities. The moment of crisis becomes the moment of greatest risk for losing national autonomy.
The issue then wraps up with these contrasting sections. Moments of vindication and moments of pure absurdity. It's a great way to end.
Let's start with the wins. What did they highlight?
Well, speed cameras were banned in Ontario, which the writer sees as a win against the 15-minute city surveillance grid.
The CDC also quietly admitted its old claim that vaccines do not cause autism was not based on evidence.
And in Alberta, there were two big wins. The Jordan Peterson Law, Bill 13, was passed to protect free speech for professionals.
And the government used the notwithstanding clause to lock in parental rights, banning gender transition surgeries for minors and requiring parental consent for pronoun changes in schools.
And a big legal win for the truckers. Kasabavizi was acquitted on all charges from the 2022 Freedom Convoy. The judge ruled the police violated his charter rights.
But then you get the absurdity observer section.
Right. For example, the Carney government removed the luxury tax on private jets and yachts, but kept on pickup trucks and farm equipment.
We also learned about the government's behavioral engineering unit, which ran a psych-op on Canadians during COVID.
The article cites a report saying this unit tested fear framing, pushed fake news, and promoted the safe and effective line long before the data was there to support it.
And then there are some concerning medical studies highlighted. One found that the autoimmune T cells causing vaccine myocarditis are not produced by the COVID infection itself.
Another big study from Spain suggested pneumococcal vaccines might actually increase the risk of getting and dying from pneumonia.
And finally, a huge review of autism studies concluded that vaccines were the single most significant modifiable risk factor. These are the challenging details being discussed in this forum.
If you take a step back and look at this entire issue, from Kelsey Sharon on MAiD to Henry on CBDCs, the core message is crystal clear.
What is it?
The need for independent thought, for moral courage, and for real grassroots unity is absolutely paramount if people want to reclaim control from these centralized institutions.
And that's exactly why Druthers matters so much. It is completely unique. It is written, funded, distributed, and promoted entirely by the people, by Canadians who believe honest news matters and are willing to act on it.
And this is where we have to ask you, the listener, to move beyond just listening. If you believe this stuff matters, we need you to take real, tangible action to support platforms like this.
You can subscribe to get the physical paper delivered to your home. You can donate to help them print more papers, like the 200,000 this month. Or you can volunteer to hand out copies in your community. Become a part of the network.
If you're the kind of person who seeks out this kind of information, who appreciates this depth of analysis, then you are exactly the kind of person who can keep this movement not just alive, but thriving.
To get involved, to subscribe, to read more, just go confidently to druthers.co.
And we'll leave you with a final thought to mull over. If the entire system, the digital architecture, the work culture, the psychological programming, if it all depends on our compliance,
how does one begin to cultivate the moral courage and the radical self-sufficiency needed to stay truly free in a world that is increasingly designed for total control?
that moral courage is the foundation of everything. Thank you for seeking out this deep dive today, and a sincere thank you to everyone who supports independent media. This movement only grows when people like you participate.
We'll see you next time.